Hello and welcome back to the Lowdown, everybody, where today we are grading every Premier League manager so far this season. Coming up, we decide what grade to give Mikel Arteta at Arsenal.
Arsenal aren't going to win any major trophies this season, and they're going to come second or third. I think that's regression.
How much responsibility does Pep Guardiola have to take for City's awful season?
I'm not expecting City to go and win the Champions League without Rodri. I am expecting them to remain competitive.
And who is the best pound-for-pound manager in the Premier League?
He is the best pound-for-pound manager England has produced since Sir Bobby Robson.
Hello and welcome back to the Lowdown, everybody. And with Mikey McCubbin away, I've called up the big guns for this week's episode. We've got Jack Collins of Ranks FC. Jack, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, Dougie. Delighted to be here. Very, very excited.
Welcome. And Buvey of the club fame and many other places. How you doing, Boov?
Yeah, fantastic, mate. Yeah, big game against Real Madrid tonight. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely massive. We won't be discussing the Champions League because by the time this comes out on Thursday, you'll know what's happened in the first round of those playoffs. Absolutely can't wait for those. But today we are grading every Premier League manager so far this season, going from F to A star. Let's see where we end up. Let's start with the top of the league, Arne Slot, Liverpool. Jack, I imagine this is going to be pretty high.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at what Arne Slot's done at the club, and look, obviously we're speaking straight after that loss to Plymouth, which is going to colour some viewpoints. I don't think it's coloured the viewpoints of Liverpool fans in particular. I think that most people are like, okay, fine, there was this kind of distant speak of a quadruple that seemed to annoy Liverpool fans more than actually kind of inspire them at this point. And I think that ultimately where the priorities lie this season are going to be always in winning the Premier League and then potentially taking a good crack at the Champions League as well. They're obviously in a League Cup final. I think that will be third priority at this point. So you grade him on what matters most to the fan base. And how often have we seen a manager take over from a legend at a club and struggle to not only put their own spin on things, but also to live up to the expectations? You go back to David Moyes taking over from Sir Alex at Manchester United. You look at even Unai Emery, who is a wonderful manager in his own right and we'll speak about, taking over from Arsene Wenger and struggling to win over the Arsenal fans. And you come to what's happened, I think, at Liverpool, where Jurgen Klopp bows out, not quite maybe on the high that he would have wanted, but with the club in a really good place. And there's always going to be questions, especially given that they were potentially after Amorim in the summer and they eventually, end up plumping for Arne Slot. And it's almost impossible to pick fault with anything that's happened since. I think that this Liverpool side look better than they were last year. Yes, okay, the competition at the top of the Premier League has dropped off a little bit with City falling away. But I think on the whole, when you're kind of looking at Slot's tenure, you kind of struggle to pick any arguments in the fact that it's almost been flawless. They have kept the ability to go into that Jurgen Klopp mania mode. They've cooled it down to be able to control games a little bit better. I think on the whole, it's almost impossible to give him anything but top grades.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, Buvey, have you been surprised by how easy he's made this change from going to Feyenoord in the Eredivisie to Liverpool and just the results they've had?
I have been surprised because I think a lot of managers come in, look at Amorim at Manchester United and they want to revolutionise things, they want to put their stamp on things, and it doesn't work. And I think he's actually lent into Jurgen Klopp, like you said, mate, and I think he's kind of, when he needs to, he has 10 minutes of spells where he gets the ball quick into the front line. He uses kind of the idea of chaos and kind of causing mayhem in the back line with Salah, with Diaz, with their running ability, even Nunes at points this season. But the thing I think that limited Liverpool in the last 6 years is about possession, how they kept control of a midfield, for example. I don't think Klopp ever focused on that. Obviously, Henderson and Fabinho were players that were, you kind of bypass the midfield, get it into the front three as soon as possible, and that's how they win games. I don't think that wins you league titles. That's why they won one league title in the 7 years. Obviously, you could talk about Man City's dominance and other factors. This Arne Slot side is built to win leagues. They'll go again next season and the season after because they got the best midfield in the league. It's not about Salah being the best player or the Van Dijk being the best centre-back in the league. They got the best midfield in the league, the best midfield in Europe. So I think he's built a side that is more consistent than what Jurgen Klopp had.
Yeah, I'd agree. And two of those 4 defeats they've had this season have been with heavily rotated sides, like the Plymouth game, the PSV game. Other than that, close to perfect. And look at the teams they had to play in the Champions League in particular, like Real Madrid, Milan, Leipzig, who were terrible in the Champions League, but still on paper a difficult game, Leverkusen. And to go 7 from 8, so impressive. I think it's very difficult not to give him an A star. Should we give him an A star to kick things off?
Easy.
So, yeah,
okay, well, this one might be a little bit more controversial. Second place is obviously Arsenal as it stands. Mikel Arteta. Buvey, what have you made of Mikel Arteta's work this season?
Well, it can't be anywhere near an A. It can't. I think maybe not even a B, because I think he spent a lot of money. He's got a side ready to go. If Liverpool were top and they were 1 point clear of Arsenal, 2 points, I could justify it. But the gap between Arsenal and Liverpool, at points, even if Man City win a certain amount of games and potentially turn things around, Man City could still finish above Arsenal. I still think that's a possibility. That's really poor. This Arsenal side are built to win Premier League titles. They spent a lot of money. Whether the transfer window in the summer is his fault or not, we can debate that. I'm not entirely sure. I feel like he's got a lot of influence at Arsenal, so I would argue he's got some responsibility for the lack of ambition in the transfer market. Arsenal had to be closer in the Premier League. They're not going to win the Champions League. They can't win the League Cup, of course. They got knocked out way too early against Newcastle, 4-0 on aggregate. That's a poor aspect to their season as well. The FA Cup as well. So Arsenal aren't going to win any major trophies this season, and they're going to come second or third. I think that's regression.
I mean, Jack, Buvey says they're not going to win the Champions League, and you're someone that takes a keen interest in European football. Where would you place them in terms of the favourites for the Champions League?
They're in the fold. I think that ultimately, look, you have to examine what we've seen so far, right? And I think that ultimately, if you came up with a Liverpool-Arsenal final right now, you'd probably struggle to suggest that Arsenal are the better side of those two. But I think there is a level of inconsistency across Europe this season. We've seen Real Madrid, who are, favourites every year for a reason in the Champions League, dropping off a little bit in the competition, obviously in that playoff round. We've seen City fall away from a domestic and a kind of European perspective. I think that you kind of have Liverpool, this Barcelona side, which I think can beat anybody on their day, but probably isn't going to be consistent enough to win La Liga. And then there's this kind of field of Arsenal. I think Atletico Madrid this season feel like they're going to be in that mixer with the depth that they have. I think Inter probably shouldn't be ruled out of the conversation at this point. And maybe if PSG continue this recent form, I know that it was a bad European campaign for them so far, but I think that they are starting to put the pieces together to potentially run this competition deep. And the fact that they've got Brest in this week, who they haven't lost to in 20 meetings ever between the two sides, suggests to me that they're going to be in the next round at the very least. So I think Arsenal are in that conversation. Look, I actually agree with quite a lot of what Buvey said there, but I think that given Arsenal have dealt with various injuries, and I know that everybody has done, and you have to take that with a grain of salt and the pinch of realism and dealing with what you've got in front of you as well. And I'm sure we'll talk about that with a lot of managers. I do think that Mikel Arteta really struggled with that original Ødegaard absence, and that it felt like Arsenal weren't able to move into the right places during that period, and that's what's opened up this gap at the top of the Premier League table. I do think that they've dealt with the absence of Saka better, and whilst I think you can definitely knock points off for not getting through in both the FA Cup and the League Cup, because I think silverware is a really important part of Arsenal's next step if they're going to continue this progression. I would say that since, with the Newcastle and United games taken out of it in the Cups, I think that Arsenal have looked a fair bit better in 2025 than maybe they did towards the back end of 2024. And I think that Arteta has taken a little bit too long to work things out, but mostly across the course of this sort of recent period has worked things out in a way that I think Arsenal will, with those players back, potentially challenging the Champions League. I think they probably will finish second in the Premier League at this point, even if other teams start to pick up the pace there. I think they'll have enough in the tank to kind of push away. So I wouldn't be maybe quite as harsh. I still don't think you could give him an A. I think maybe you'd give him a B for this season, given that Arsenal have still looked pretty cohesive and, in this transfer market. And yes, we might be right on that one. In the summer, I think that, he made a point of being like, look, we like having Kai Havertz as a 9. And look, I think that's probably fair enough in some capacities, but not being able to push players on, not being able to look in different areas and sometimes understand that you need something different to kick things in a different way, probably counts against him. I think it's probably, you don't count that against him for January because he came out and said, this is what I'm looking for, and didn't get delivered it. But I think maybe the squad building in the summer potentially does count against him a little bit.
Yeah, I think we're going to come back to this point quite a lot throughout the course of the episode. Like, how much responsibility for recruitment do you put on the manager? And often, at these clubs, there's a team of analysts, there's a team of people working under a sporting director. It really is a whole club job, and managers often don't get what they want. We'll probably get onto that with Ange Postecoglou, and maybe he was slightly sold short as well. Mikel Arteta, I think they probably did strengthen too much in defence, but then he was so burnt the year before last in the run-in when Saliba got injured. And now they do have so much depth in every defensive area. But I think most people were calling for, you need a more natural backup to Bukayo Saka. And look, Nwaneri's arrived on the scene and has looked amazing. But also a natural backup to Odegaard. You've got to cover for your worst case scenarios.
Well, they had one in Fabio Vieira as well, and they just decided not to utilise him. And he's gone back to Porto, and he's been okay.
Yeah.
Well, he hasn't set the world on fire, fine. The emergence of Rodrigo Moura has kind of counted against him in that count. But they did have a player there who was able to fulfil that role. And
he wasn't good enough, was he?
Maybe not. But
the point nowhere near physical enough for the league.
Would you rather have nobody in that area?
Well, Nwaneri is the one. I think he didn't gamble enough early in the season.
Yeah,
I know he had a few minutes in sort of October. He's coming through, and now he's playing. He's actually starting games, and rightfully so. I think Arteta. The big thing about Arteta, you look back in the history books. No one remembers who comes second, but Arsenal fans will remember that they threw their principles away. They were a very attacking, open-minded side 2-3 years ago. They used to go at sides. They went at City, lost 4-1 at the Etihad. Rob Holding came in, but they had a go. They had principles. They've sold their principles for pragmatism, and pragmatism hasn't led them to winning anything this season. You can't be pragmatic at a big club like Arsenal and not win anything. That's the issue for me.
Yeah, I do think they did play the best football in the league last year, and this year I think it's very difficult to put them anywhere close to playing the best football in the league. Like, their shots per game are down to 13.7. That's 11th in the league. And yes, they've had injury issues, but which top side hasn't, on the back of an international summer and expanded European competition, have some sort of injury issues at some stages this season? I think Liverpool, have probably had the best luck with injuries, but they've still missed key players at different points.
Yeah.
Arsenal's drop-off's been... Sorry?
The red cards.
The red cards
injuries,
as well.
That's not their fault. Of course not. Red cards, I think it comes down from... We're talking about the managers. The manager is on the touchline shouting. He's energetic. He's far too high energy. He takes a lot of the limelight, in my opinion. And the players respond to that. Some of the sendings off, the cynicism in the Arsenal 11, for me, comes from Arteta. Some of the red cards have cost them points this season.
Definitely. And some of them were contentious. Obviously, Lewis Skelly's shouldn't be a red card. But Saliba, I think, is a 50-50. I've heard a lot of people say that is a red card. I've heard a lot of people... Trossard and Rice is a bit of stupidity. It's a bit unfortunate that no one else has been done for it, but it is the enforcement of the rules. And yes, it's annoying when there's inconsistency in the enforcement of the rules, but by the letter of the law, they were red cards. I think Mikel Arteta, for me, can't be any higher than a C. I had a C down as well. Jack, are you happy to go with a C?
I will take it. I would have had him higher. I would have had him as a B. I think what I do respect about Arteta is that I think he's learning. And I think that actually, you see the reaction after the City game the other day. And I completely agree with you in terms of the emotions. And we'll talk again about managers being too high and low and teams becoming too emotional. I think it potentially got to Liverpool a bit last season at the end of the Jurgen Klopp era. I don't often think that every game feeling like a cup final helps, at either end of the table, to be honest. But I think that what we saw after the City game with a little bit more restraint, etc., suggests to me that Mikel Arteta is learning. And it is easy to forget that he is a young manager early in his career, even if he has had a reasonably longer spell at Arsenal now than perhaps, maybe many thought at the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. Right, let's move down to Nottingham Forest in third. I say move down. What a season they are having. Third, 6 points clear of Man City in fifth. They finished with 32 points last year. They've already got 47. They're on track for 74 points. It is absolutely remarkable. And whilst you can give, and rightly so much credit to some players there like Chris Wood, Murillo, Gibbs-White, Milenkovic, Ole Einer's had an amazing year. It does feel like, more so than any other club this year, a lot of this has got to go on Nuno, because he was handed a squad that was built across many transfer windows with a bit of a mess of a transfer strategy, and he's picked out the players that fit his style of play. And yes, it's quite unique to see a side up in third that average the lowest amount of possession in the league, that the 19th best pass accuracy in the league, and yet he makes it work. I think this has got to be an A-star for me. Buvey, would you have him right up there as well?
Yeah, it has to be A-star. I think if Arne Slot wins the title, it's always going to be Arne Slot, but I think he's literally the second best manager performance this season, because he's getting players that, a few years ago we thought Chris Wood was a championship striker, and rightly so. He played a lot of his time in the second division, and fair play to him for earning his right to be scoring goals in the Premier League. He deserves to be who he is right now. But Nuno's created this guy. He's far more finesse than I've ever seen. Chris Wood, I mean, seriously, he's a very silky player. He links play up very, very well. He's scoring delicate goals as well, not all just tap-ins or headers from 10 yards out. And that's down to Nuno. Nuno's a very, very pragmatic manager. He's a nasty manager as well. He makes a bit like Mourinho at Chelsea when he first came in. Everyone wants to fight for him. Everyone's defensive about their side. And Nottingham Forest, they're a nasty side, very aggressive. And I'd love it if I was a Forest fan. He's done unbelievably well.
Yeah, for sure. And great to see Jack after a difficult time at Spurs, having to go to Saudi Arabia to kind of rebuild his career. Like, he's had setbacks.
Yeah, difficult time in Saudi Arabia as well. You know, obviously fallouts with some big names at Al Ittihad, and they got rid of him pretty quickly when it all came to the crunch. But I think and he was one of 3 managers that I gave a star kind of in my head before we came in. I'm sure we'll come to the rest. But when you kind of look at what he's done here, this Forest side are quite similar in some ways to what Nuno did at Wolves, right? And I think that there is an element with a side like Wolves or like Forest who people aren't necessarily expecting to be in these areas in the pitch, where you can play a little bit more transitionally, you can play a little bit more directly, and Forest are exceptionally good at it. What I really like about what Nuno's done this year is that Wolves side were capable of giving big teams bloody noses, right? They were a very, very good unit, and they liked to kind of step up. And in those bigger games, they often stepped up. But it was the games where people gave them the ball and were like, here you go then, do it, that they kind of struggled with. We haven't really seen that with Forest this year, and that's evolution. You love seeing a manager kind of evolve, even in games where the other team are like, right, okay, we don't want the ball either. Forest are finding ways to draw them onto them. They're finding ways to win those games that perhaps that Wolves side didn't. They were brilliant, and they got to Europe and all of those things, but we never saw them in this kind of position in the league at this point in the season. And I think that is partly to do with the fact that Nuno's system and structures have evolved to the point where he can now win games where teams are willing to sit in a little bit deeper. He is finding players who are able to pick up the pockets and make a difference in those spaces. And that, for me, I think is what elevates this from, you know, a season where Forest would be challenging for Conference League, Europa League football to one where they're challenging and look very good for right now for Champions League football.
Yeah, absolutely. Took some heat for predicting them to finish 6th last week. I mean, fair enough. They are absolutely flying. Let's see how long it can continue. Good luck to them. Right, let's move on to Chelsea. Enzo Maresca, Jack. Like, I think if we asked this maybe a couple of months ago, it might be a higher ranking. But where do you grade him at the moment?
It's a really tough one, and I know that Chelsea fans are really frustrated at the moment with what we've seen. Early in the season, I thought what Maresca did in terms of giving a freshness to this team, not being as stuck to his methodologies as we saw with Leicester in the Championship, having that ability to look at the squad and basically pick the best players to go and do the task, I thought was really impressive. And whilst I think it was fair that Chelsea fans and Maresca himself stepped back and said, we're probably not in a title race, this is still a very young squad, and it is the youngest average starting 11 in the Premier League this season. This is Maresca's 2nd season in senior management after being in the Championship last year, so first Premier League season. I still think having them in this position and in a Champions League spot currently would have been considered a success. If you'd offered Chelsea fans at the start of this year being in a Champions League spot and looking pretty good to win the Conference League. I know it's European Cup, European knockout competition. Anything can happen, and the Conference League is weird at the best of times, right? But it looks it would be a massive shock if Chelsea didn't go and win the Conference League from here. I think if you'd offered Chelsea fans that, they would have snapped your hand off for it at the start of the season. So it's difficult to criticise him from the perspective of where they are right now. What I'm struggling with Maresca is that in recent weeks, I think he's not quite abandoned his principles, but gone back to a level where what we saw a lot of with Leicester in the kind of back half of the Championship last year, where teams worked them out a little bit and he didn't really adapt right until the end in order to push them back over the line for that title. And a lot of the criticism around Chelsea right now is that they've been incredibly passive and that actually it's a little bit like watching Sarri's Chelsea side at times. And I think that that's frustrating people because they saw what Chelsea were good at earlier in the season, and that doesn't seem to be in effect quite as much anymore. Maresca was being bold with his selections. He was making changes.
Bold with his subs as well, yeah.
That's what I mean. Early on in games, trying to fix it. And, recently in certain games, I think that he's maybe shifted a little bit back towards that. But I think that from a position where if we'd done this in December, we'd be grading him as an A, pushing on a star, we're probably now putting him in that B category for me.
Yeah, I had him down as B-. I mean, Buvey, do you put any responsibility for that at their sum of business again? Because the stars of their campaign this year are the players that have had longer to adapt, and he got given a much bigger squad again to work with, and that has helped them in the Conference League. But you look at Pedro Neto, João Felix, Dewsbury Hall, Jorgensen, Renato Vega's now left. Sancho's not really pulled up any trees. The keeper's been a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
How much do we put on Maresca for this, or is this the recruitment team?
Well, if Arne Slot had to deal with it, he wouldn't be on an A right now, or an A star. Or Guardiola, when he came in, Guardiola had a nucleus of players. David Silva was still there, company, Aguero. And Maresca's a million miles away from having any kind of side to win the title. So we can debate if that's his fault or not. The João Felix move feels really backwards. You brought him in for a reason. Someone has. Maybe it's not him.
Grease the wheels of the Conor Gallagher transfer.
for no financial gain as well, because you kind of let him go to AC Milan. The keeper situation. There was a moment in December where they were winning games. They were a couple of points off being top of the table, and I said to my mate at the time, I said, "You're one world class centre back away and a keeper." A bit like when Liverpool signed Alisson and Van Dijk. I thought they were 2 away from being a serious title contender even this season, and now they look like top 4, kind of a general top 4 side. I don't know if that's down to him necessarily. I think he has been tactically inflexible. But the issue is, come May, wherever Chelsea finish 4th or 5th, I think they'll finish just about in the Champions League spots. They don't look like they progress next season to winning the Premier League. So I don't know if it feels like a B for me. It's not necessarily an A grade. I think it'd be maybe a B, a low B.
Oh, there's also just not been enough progress in cup competitions outside the Conference League. Like Chelsea for so long were built off just regular trophies every couple of years.
Yeah.
And, a Carabao Cup final last year, sure, but exiting quite meekly to Brighton at the weekend in the FA Cup, only had 1 shot on target. They've only won 2 of their last 8 league games. This has to be taken into account when you grade someone. I had them down as B-. I don't think it's a disaster, as we say. I agree with Jack, 12th, 6th, finishing the top 4. That's a sign of progress. But is it what we necessarily expected in October, November time? Probably not. So
is it what we expected in August? Maybe.
Yeah.
Right. So that's made the difference. I think obviously the more success you have, the more pressure falls upon your shoulders. And I thought he did a very good job in trying to deflect that pressure off his players. But also there is an element, I think, with Chelsea at the moment where it just feels like there's not enough adults in the dressing room.
No,
and I know that sounds ridiculous, but with such a young squad, when things are going a little bit wrong, you need someone to sort of just grab things by the scruff of the neck. And look, this is part of the culture change at Chelsea, and I appreciate that. Longer term, I think this is still going to have its rewards. But it does feel like a manager in his second season in senior management, coupled with a squad that's that's putting out the youngest starting 11 in the Premier League, and that your captains are all sort of in that age range as well. It feels like there's maybe just not enough nous to guide them over a line. And I'm not sure if I can lay that at Maresca's door or anyone else's, but I do think that his ability to manage games has dropped off in the last month or two.
I think that's fair to say. Yeah, I remember when Reece James was named captain, people were like, oh, that's an interesting choice. But then people made the point of, well, sort of who else in this squad?
Yeah.
I think maybe Levi Colwill, but again, he's so young.
I was going to say, is there not much game?
So, I mean, we need to settle on a grade. Jack, I'll let you have the final call on this. I would say B-.
Yeah, B. Yeah.
B-, B.
Let's go with B-. Right. Okay, let's move to Man City. Buvey's beloved. Buvey,
my French cousin.
Your French cousin, exactly. Your beloved Man City. Pep Guardiola. There's so much to dissect with Man City. How much of the blame do you put on Pep's door?
Well, you have to say a large amount. It's one injury. I can say at the highest level, Rodri affects every aspect of Man City. So in terms of can Man City win the Champions League without Rodri, I'd say it makes us very uncompetitive in that conversation. To win the Premier League against Liverpool with Van Dijk, with Salah being in world-class form, it's very hard. But City shouldn't be that far off. City shouldn't be losing 5-1 to Arsenal, shouldn't be losing to Manchester United, Spurs home and away, Bournemouth, Brighton, PSG was shocking. PSG was real bad. And that's down to the back line. That's down to when players come back from injury. There's obviously an element of the squad being very, very stretched. John Stones comes back, then he gets injured. Akanji's coming in and out of injury. The Kyle Walker situation was relatively, I thought, poorly managed. Whether that's down to the player side or Guardiola, that's hard to sort of say. But ultimately, we can't defend. We've lost the philosophy of keeping the ball to a far better extent. There are City sides without strikers that are way better than this side. Do you know what I mean? We've got Haaland down the middle. And this City side can't even keep the ball, let alone give it to Erling Haaland. So a large part of it is down to Guardiola. The biggest crime that Guardiola has in the last few months, whether that leads to City winning nothing this season, dropping out the Champions League or not, is that there's a lack of philosophy. It's not like we're trying to keep the ball and actually keeping this philosophy going and we're just losing games anyway and getting hit on the counter-attack. Fair enough. But there's this element sometimes of a long ball into Haaland. That worked against Chelsea. Then that got removed against Arsenal. Not keeping the ball in big moments. The rotation of De Bruyne. De Bruyne's not really trusted in certain games. Didn't start against Arsenal. Football Club couldn't believe it. So a large part of it is Guardiola, I think, being very, very stretched. Obviously, there are certain aspects of his personal life. Obviously, I can't comment on them. But sometimes a manager actually dips in their form. Sir Alex Ferguson wasn't great for 25 years in a row. He dipped in his form as a manager. So a large percentage of this performance for Guardiola is at his doorstep.
And what Sir Alex was complimented so many times, Jack, was rebuilding sides. And
Yeah.
it wasn't always seamless. And Pep so far has largely been seamless between that sort of Centurion side to that more defensive side that came. But this rebuild seems like it's gone a little bit awry.
Yeah, I think, it goes back to that point about expectations against reality, right? And not just in terms of where City are in the table or where they've been in the Champions League. What I struggle with is that over the last few years, we've seen Pep innovate or bring through new or old, recycle old formations that have allowed City to complete this dominance, to keep that control. And when Rodri went down, and look, yes, Rodri would be a miss for any side in the world. And he is the current Ballon d'Or winner and probably the best player in the world, definitely the best defensive midfielder in the world. But also, he can't be the only load-bearing wall in the entire City operation. It feels like they took it out and the structure of the entire building collapsed. And that is a worry from not just a playing perspective, but also a squad-building perspective. We know that Guardiola wants to work with smaller sides. We understand that as a kind of squad. But when your squad are getting older, when you're relying on the veterans, when you bring back Ilkay Gundogan as, a potential bit part player who might be able to do a little bit here at the base and a little bit maybe further forward when Haaland can't play, and then suddenly he's having to play every single minute of every single game because you don't have any other options. I think that suggests to me that the Pep has struggled to actually find solutions here. And this is the first time I think we've seen that really at Manchester City. So it comes back to, what are you expecting from Pep? Okay, I'm not expecting him to go and storm to a league title without Rodri. I'm not expecting City to go and win the Champions League without Rodri. I am expecting them to remain competitive. I am expecting them to find solutions in that middle area and not for 3 months be the world's easiest team to transition through. Like, there are levels to it that you're thinking, what's Pep doing? Well, look, we discussed this in various formats, you and I, Dougie, on The Truth and lots of different things, but it felt like he was refusing to try new things in that area, whether that be, we've seen John Stones move forward into that area from a defensive role before and basically play there. We saw none of that. Yes, you're right, Buvey, he got injured obviously quickly again, but there was no attempt to try it even before that happened. We've seen defenders move into those areas. None of it sort of changed, and it just kept being a run out of Kovacic or Bernardo Silva or Ilkay Gundogan, and City just looked hapless through the middle. And for me, that's, I think, the thing that I hold against Guardiola here is I don't mind City falling off a little bit because they've lost the best defensive midfielder in the world, the sixth that it's all built on. I mind not having any sort of ability to create a solution, despite the fact there are so many brilliant players at your doorstep. Yes, there are mitigating circumstances in terms of injuries, but in terms of expectation towards reality, I think this has been the biggest drop-off for me this season.
I'm hearing D.
Low C because I'm
I
biased.
had him at C-.
City started strong, by the way. Don't forget. The
Yeah.
only reason we're in the contention of top 4 is because we started so well. So that has to be a factor in this.
Nice. Let's settle with C- for Pep Guardiola. Who thought we'd be saying that at the start of the season?
I think you'll work it out for what it's worth, but
Yeah.
it just
Yeah.
feels
I
like
think
it's
that-
going to take a bit longer than everyone expected.
For sure. Right, let's go to Newcastle. Eddie Howe. I actually rate this season from Eddie Howe really, really highly. I think he's had huge injury issues. Harvey Barnes has missed the last 6 weeks or so. Callum Wilson has only played 58 league minutes. Sven Botman has started 3 league games. They haven't had Pope available. He's brought through 2 new fullbacks. Fabian Schär's probably not been quite the same level as a few years ago. Trippier's now out that side. He rebuilt that midfield when it wasn't quite clicking with Tonali playing as an 8, and he's brought him back into a 6. And that midfield now looks like one of the best in the league, if not the best in the league in this recent run of form. They've now won 7 of their last 9 games. And he also hasn't been backed in the transfer market to the extent that Newcastle fans thought they would. They made a £17 million profit on transfers this season. And you look at the expenditure of sides like Aston Villa behind them as well. Look at Man City just in front of them.
Brighton.
And yet Brighton, they're right up there. Even Bournemouth signed FC Porto striker. So I think Newcastle and Eddie Howe deserve enormous amounts of credit. And I can't really believe I'm saying that as a Sunderland fan, but it's true. You've got to say what you see. And also even in January, they've lost Almiron, they've lost Lloyd Kelly. Look, these weren't crucial members of their squad at all. But they've again lost players in January. They lost Anderson and Minter in the summer. Ideally, they'd have probably kept both of them, but they had to because of PSR. And yet they're still in with a shout of qualifying for the Champions League and winning their first trophy since, 1955? So I was close to giving this an A star, but at the moment I'm just giving it an A. Would you agree with that,
It has
Buvey?
to be an A star. Has to be an A star. This is a club that are absolutely chronically starved for success for major silverware. Nothing since 1955, not a league title since the 1920s. He is the best pound-for-pound manager England has produced since Sir Bobby Robson. I think he's outrageously good, Eddie Howe. I think he lifts the place up. I think he gets fans on side. And we're talking about like Guardiola, for example, not innovating, and he's at a point of his career, he needs to find the next solution. Like Eddie Howe's side, when he was at Bournemouth, when they first got promoted, easy to play against. They had a great sort of attacking output, but they were quite soft defensively. That's what probably got them relegated in the first place with Eddie Howe. He's now become a manager. It's very defensively shrewd. He's got two of the best fullbacks in the league. He's figured out the kind of keeper situation, what he wants from his keeper. The two centre-backs, fantastic. I love Botman. He's turned into a pragmatic defensive manager. I think all round, he's the best pound-for-pound manager, maybe in the Premier League. But it's outstanding.
So would you give him an A-star as well, Jack? I was saving an A-star for another manager.
So was I. And I think I would call that manager the best pound-for-pound manager in the Premier League. But we can come to that. I agree with pretty much all of what both you said. But he's also done the kind of almost anti-Guardiola, Eddie Howe. They started the season really poorly and they have worked it out. But, you know, the reason that they are not higher up in this table is because of that really weak start. And, you know, you go back to that defeat to Brentford where they looked completely and utterly all over the place. And the turnaround from there has been absolutely sensational. And Howe deserves immense credit for that. I'm a little bit wary of giving him a star when I'm a bit like, did it take you slightly too long to work out that all you need to do here is maybe tinker with the midfield a little bit and make sure that the balance is struck there, that Jacob Murphy needs to start on the right because Anthony Gordon and Harvey Barnes have really struggled to play together, and the balance of that side with Murphy coming through on the right-hand side
what a season he's
so
had.
much better. What a season. I declare for the Republic of Ireland, please, Jacob. But there's a separate point, like, there is also an element when you have this kind of renaissance, if you will, that it's come from a point of quite a low. And it's the only thing that I'd maybe hold against Howe a little bit, that it took him slightly too long to work it out. This season obviously goes to a star if Newcastle win a trophy immediately. It would kind of supersede everything else. Newcastle could finish 17th and win a trophy, and I think most fans would give them a star for actually breaking that dark. But what we've seen from them, I think that they are now probably second favourites to go and maybe win the FA Cup as well, considering the teams that have dropped out. They have a real shot at not just lifting one trophy, but potentially lifting two this season and being back in the Champions League. That's
outrageous. That's outrageous.
It's an immense turnaround. I would have given him an A.
Championship, isn't he, lads? Like, let's be honest, he was a bit like Chris Wood. He's a championship player. Like, he is, and he's morphed himself because of Eddie Howe into a not just a Premier League player, a top level winger that is influencing games at the highest level. It's outstanding.
I'm just thinking about the fact of Newcastle winning 2 trophies. I'm moving abroad if that happens, for sure. Let's settle with A for that, because it was 2 versus 1 on that. We've also got 13 more teams to get through, so let's keep the momentum. Andoni Iraola, Jack. Bournemouth, I think this might be who you were talking about.
The best pound-for-pound manager in the Premier League, yeah. Look, this Bournemouth season is exceptional. And you mentioned the fact that they went and signed Evan Nilsson from Porto for a lot of money. The only reason that came about was because Solanke moved to Spurs so late in the window. And yes, it means that the money is floating around kind of in the ether in the Premier League, but you still have to go and spend it wisely. What Andoni Iraola has done with this Bournemouth side, bear in mind...
Back 12 men.
Yeah, I mean, it's nuts. It's nuts. Bear in mind that, we're talking about players who have made the step up. Ryan Christie has become like a war horse of an 8. Now, this was a man that was floating around as a 10/winger at Celtic, and lovely footballer, but I don't think anyone had this going. The amount of injuries that Bournemouth have had to deal with, I think, goes represented and underreported. They went to that game at St James's Park recently with 11 senior players and absolutely blew Newcastle out of the water. I think that what we've seen from this Bournemouth side, the intensity that they play with, the results that they've had against the biggest names, and also the fact that Iraola has had to deal with, a variety of players coming in, out, and moving around. He's put together, for me, one of the best centre-back partnerships and one of the best young centre-back partnerships in world football in Zabani and Dean Hyson, who have been immense since they came in. There's been some stories of players having these renaissances. Kepa, who'd have thought that Kepa would be in a side performing to this level? When he left Chelsea under a cloud. I said about Ryan Christie, but I think that Cook as well has been exceptional in this team. Justin Kluivert bounced around Europe, couldn't really get a game at Ajax, couldn't hugely get a game at Roma, struggled a little bit in his time in France. the amount of players here that were kind of cast off or moved out by other players, even Semenyo has been exceptional. Was a player playing in the really lower reaches.
Struggled on loan at Sunderland.
Exactly, playing in the lower reaches of the Football League pyramid for a long period of time. I think that what this side has become and the way that they have kept rolling without either striker fit now with Enes Ünal and Evan Nilsson out, and Ouattara just becoming an exceptionally cool front man in terms of dovetailing with the other two. I've been so impressed with everything Iraola has done. And, you look back at his Rayo Vallecano team in Spain, and they were a bit like, we talked about Wolves earlier. They were kind of punch hitters upwards, but not consistent at all. And what the turnaround and the kind of evolution of this Bournemouth side, especially from the fact that, 3 months after he was appointed, Bournemouth were in the bottom three, and people were like, we made a mistake getting rid of Gary O'Neill, to where they are now. I couldn't give anything but a star. I love Iraola.
The only thing for that would be Bournemouth are a small club, and I'd say the pressure is way less compared to Newcastle. If he went to Newcastle, would he succeed in the same way? I think he would. I'd give him A star as well. I'm very generous with these A stars.
I like it. Seriously. Top marks all round. Let's give him an A star.
To the bottom half of the table. It's going to be brutal.
Wait and see. We do need to get there. Aston Villa, Unai Emery in 8th. Buvey.
Oh, he's been outrageous, hasn't he? He's been outrageous. It already it's a week into the January transfer window ending, but Asensio looks fantastic. Has Rashford been reborn already? They've got the opportunity to obviously win silverware as well, which is massive for Aston Villa in a similar way it is to Newcastle United. It's also interesting. It's not always about new signings. Someone like Morgan Rogers has been in the side for a few years. He's turned into this kind of Steven Gerrard reborn physical powerhouse that can do everything from midfield. Absolutely outrageous. So Unai Emery, his standard was so high from last season, getting wins in the Champions League this season, getting him into the knockout stages. They're going to go far in that competition. It's almost like, has he even improved? Because last season he was already so good. I was on certain videos, like last season I was giving him A stars, A pluses. He was the best manager probably pound for pound last season. I don't think he's dropped off that much. I understand the league form dipping a little bit. They've had multiple focuses. They've not had the best squad in the world. Had to get rid of Douglas Luiz and players like that. Duran looks like a very, very smart bit of business now as well, even though I was against it at the time, because I don't think selling someone as profligate, as successful as a striker as he is necessarily the best thing to do in the world at 21. But their squad looks so balanced. I just think it's outrageous what he's doing.
Yeah, the Champions League could get really interesting as well. They'll play either Club Brugge, Atalanta, Sporting CP or Dortmund. And all those ties, except for Atalanta, I'd probably say they're favourites in. So, yeah, it could be pretty magical. It could be a last 16 and then, it could be a quarter final and then who knows from there. So let's see what happens there. I went B with Unai Emery just because that league drop off. Would you, Buvey, where did you have
I was going to say A.
A,
yeah, I gave him an A-, so we're sort of in the middle.
Let's go with A-. Let's go with A-.
A little bit. The only thing I think you can hold against him, I think the Champions League stuff has been really, really impressive. It's just the fact that they can't seem to be able to turn it on the weekends after Champions League football, and I don't know if that's necessarily a criticism.
Maybe the January
of Emery
business
or
helps
the
with
squad.
that.
Yeah, maybe a little bit, and they didn't have the opportunity to rebuild perhaps as much as they thought they would in the summer, given that they had just achieved Champions League football. So potentially this is kind of a PSR thing, and there's a lot going on in that regard. I still think it's been pretty exceptional, but maybe just a little bit of a drop from last year and where they were at. So that's why I took it off a little bit.
Let's go with A-. 9th, Fulham, Marco Silva, Jack. Now, we did a space on Sky Sports Premier League's X account a couple of weeks ago, and you actually pointed out some points about some of the players that have had a lot of praise, like Emile Smith-Rowe, maybe having a little bit more of a drop-off in the last few weeks, etc. But some of the players and performances he's got out of the likes of Anthony Robinson and Sander Berge when he's been fit as well, he's done a really good job.
Yeah, replacing Paulinho in the summer was the big thing. We talk about load-bearing Wolves when we talk about Rodri, right? But Paulinho was Fulham's, right? He was the main defensive component that has led to 2 very secure seasons in the Premier League. And look, Marco Silva's doing a really, really wonderful job at Fulham. And at times it feels like he's the only person holding the entire club together. So he deserves immense credit and praise for everything he's doing, with a lot of off-field issues kind of swirling about in the fan base. So all of that, I think, matters. But there is also kind of a sense of a little tad of frustration, I think, around Fulham this season. Yes, there have been some really impressive wins, historic wins. The win at Chelsea at Boxing Day, first time Fulham have done that, for lifetimes, right? So
one of your favourite ever days.
Just one of the greatest days ever. But that's a separate point. Right? It was incredible, and we've had some really impressive results. In fact, against the top sides, Fulham have been excellent, right? Really good performance up at the Etihad, where if Adama Traore could finish his dinner, Fulham would have probably won that game. The draw against Liverpool, went toe-to-toe with them. Yes, they had 10 men, but I thought that Fulham gave a good account of themselves there. 1-1 against Arsenal, beaten Newcastle twice this season already. There have been some really impressive performances against the top sides, but Fulham are a little bit the Robin Hood of the Premier League. We steal from the rich and give to the poor. And you look at the Fulham record against the bottom six, and it's far less impressive reading. The frustration with a 0-0 draw against Southampton at home, dropping 4 points to Ipswich, losing 4-1 to Wolves when they were under Gary O'Neill. There's been a lot of frustration around those results, because I think that if Fulham had been able to turn those games against the bottom sides into wins, we'd be having a conversation about this being an all-timer of a Fulham season. As it is, it remains just a good season with some excellent high points. I think Fulham might well still be in that conversation for Europa League spot, especially as teams have to deal with more competitions towards the back half of the season. And I think there's an outside chance, even getting Manchester United away in the FA Cup, that Fulham might make Wembley in that competition as well. But I think that we're at a place where Marco Silva's management has been brilliant on the most part. There are just a few kicks that kind of take us away from where Bournemouth and Forest are. Those three clubs came up together, and a lot of the discourse this season has been about the three clubs that maybe no one expected to be in the top half, being Forest and Fulham and Bournemouth. I think Fulham are probably a kind of tad off the other two in terms of being able to grind out the important results at the best of times. So I had Marco Silva as an A-.
Okay, A-, let's go with that. Let's go to Brighton, Fabian Hurzeler. Now, this is quite interesting because this is kind of the side that are sort of the definition of mid-table right now. They're 9 points off the top four. They are 8 points ahead of 16th place Everton. They've only won 2 of their last 12 league games versus Ipswich and Man United, both, given their current form, very winnable fixtures as well. They did beat Chelsea in the FA Cup at the weekend, but they spent a lot of money this summer. They spent £232 million. Their net spend was £191 million. That was the biggest in the world. Biggest in the world. Al Nassr were next with 129 million, then Ipswich, then Man United, which does go to show the financial strength of the Premier League, that Ipswich and Brighton are amongst the top three.
That actually buying loads of players doesn't often work.
Which I do think is a good point to make, because when you bring in 6 or 7 players, fans, including myself on social media, often say like, oh, West Ham, Brighton, they've won the window or whatever. Stable clubs don't sign 6 or 7 players. I think that is partly why Forest had some real up and down years, and even now it feels like some of their squad building's a little bit loose at points. But Chelsea have struggled at points.
Fulham did it, didn't they? A couple of years ago.
Fulham did it as well. It's difficult to spend that amount of money and all those players to gel, because what is it? Maybe 30% of transfers work out as you kind of want them to. At the same time, I think...
You might look back at this Brighton window in 2 years' time and go, what a window.
Yeah,
that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. I don't think they've signed bad players at all. I don't think it's been a disaster of a season, but I actually had them down as a C+. I don't know whether that's a bit harsh.
This is Brighton. I mean, with all due respect, they were a League Two side when I was younger. I mean, they've done incredibly well. Any season they're mid-table in the Premier League is always at least a B. That's their par. It's generational stuff for Brighton fans.
Should we put B- then?
But then it has to go above that, because they're in the further stages of the FA Cup. That was a huge win. And I know that the loss to Nottingham Forest just before that, it was like a 60-year kind of loss. It was like 1 in 60 years. Terrible loss. 7-0, I think it was. But it doesn't matter, because the FA Cup is still a massive opportunity for Brighton. You see Watford get to a final recently, and Wigan can win it. They could win the FA Cup, and that would still be a massive season. And Hurzeler, so impressed with Hurzeler. He's been incredible at the start of the season. I know they've fallen off, but and some of those signings, I know a lot of money, but Mins has been fantastic. Mitoma's still at the club. That says that is ambition right there. Mm-hmm. If Mitoma was a Liverpool player, FSG would have sold him. Do you know what I mean? Man United might have sold him. Brighton are so ambitious, they keep Mitoma from a potential £90 million bid. That happened at Brighton.
I'd actually say that's quite foolish personally, but then
fair enough. But he still scored a massive goal, didn't he, recently as well? Rutter's coming from Leeds United. He's fantastic. They got 6 or 7 transfers in the last couple of years. They're like 10 out of 10 transfers. Unbelievable deals. So they got a great platform for success. It has to be at least a B.
Jack, you get a final say.
I think with Hurzeler, there have been some real teething problems. Like, obviously, the start of the season was historic. I think it was Brighton's best ever start. I think there is an element, and we talked about this with a couple of managers, but it feels like they've worked out a little bit more what he's trying to do. Equally, we're talking about a coach who has basically managed in the Zweite Bundesliga, took over kind of temporarily at St. Pauli, and then was kind of promoted to the senior job, and did a really, really good job at Pauli with very little budget. He's now come into a Brighton side that, as you say, are the biggest spending side in the world. That's a different challenge. And I think that, making sure all those players work and getting them in the right positions is something that's going to be difficult for any manager. but especially one who's still again in the kind of rookie years of his managerial, we say apprenticeship. But you kind of get to that, and I think that there have been moments where you look at what Brighton have done and thought, tactically, that feels really, really off. Playing a single
5 forwards against Forest
and a single defensive midfielder in Jack Hinchelwood. It was like one man with a sword against a cavalry charge.
It was Jon Snow.
It was Jon Snow. It was Jon Snow. And I think that when you're putting all of that together, Hurzeler, I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt. I think he's going to be an excellent manager. I really do. And I think what he's achieved already is really impressive. I would probably pull him down a little bit just in terms of he's been a little bit tactically naive at some point. But Brighton are fine, right? Like they're not going to be dragged into a relegation scrap. They have a chance. They're another side. And I agree with Buvey, who on their day can kind of go against anyone, who on their day would be able to cause some upsets, and that gives them a shot at going and potentially getting back to an FA Cup semi-final and potentially even further than that as well. So if that was to happen, then that's progress. I think there's just been a little bit of a drawback from what De Zerbi did last year, and maybe actually just resetting the club that probably knocks Hurzeler down to a B- from me.
Okay, let's go with B-. Right, we've got 10 to go, and Buvey's taxi is coming in 20 minutes, so we're on a bit of a deadline. The taxi man's going to be in here, starring in the Lowdown. Elsewise, Brentford 11th. Thomas Frank. Buvey, I think this has got to be pretty high again.
Yeah, and for Brentford, again, it's a bit like Brighton. I think what I'd say about the Premier League is the highest standard of managers the league's ever seen. I think the standard of play of individual players aren't as good, and maybe that's down to systems over individual quality. Thomas Frank is one of the best managers in the league, and what he's done for Brentford is one of the best managers in Europe. And it's a bit like Silva, it's a bit like Hurzeler, it's a bit like Nuno, Espirito, Santo. It has to be at least a B. This is Brentford, and they're punching in the Premier League every
I wanted to
season.
give him an A- because losing Tony, Igor Thiago's not really been able to play.
Yeah.
He's still not had Hickey or Henry. There's been big injuries throughout that squad. Some of his signings, Fabio Carvalho, Step Vandenberg, they haven't necessarily clicked to the extent people expected them to. And yet they are comfortable again. I went A-.
I would have gone B-, similar to Hurzeler, just because with Thomas Frank this year, and look, I agree, I think he's an excellent manager, and that actually he's shown in various aspects for the last few years just what he's about and what he's capable of. I feel like Brentford have been overly defensive this year, and especially in games where you'd kind of expect them to step on and potentially show their calibre, they have felt slightly one-dimensional. Partly sympathy in that Igor Thiago maybe would have been able to allow them to play that slightly more direct style that Ivan Toney did. But I think that he's been hamstrung a little bit by the lack of fullbacks that have been able to get forward and
in that system.
Big part of what Thomas Frank is trying to do. But I feel like he's really stood back a little bit from being quite as adventurous, and I think it's held Brentford back a tiny bit in terms of how they are. That the ability to go out and actually cause bloody noses to really hurt teams, especially when they've been in the ascendancy, hasn't been there, I think, quite as much this year. And I think that Brentford fans obviously will be delighted that Thomas Frank is still there and still doing a very, very good job. But maybe we'll want to see a little bit more from this team this year.
Buvey, you get final say.
Has to be a B.
Let's go with B. I was going A-, but B's good. 12th, Crystal Palace, Ollie Glasner. I think really underrated job as well. Lost Elise in the summer. Look at the level that he's recreating at Bayern Munich already. Lost Joachim Andersen, absolutely integral to that side. Brought in Nketiah, hasn't worked. Lacroix's been amazing. Riyad's had injury issues as Melissar took a while to warm up. And yet, I think since the 27th of October, they are 7th for points won. They had a really difficult start to the season. But he's lost Chalobah mid-season as well. I think it's really underrated. I went with B+.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And also, when you start a season so weakly as Palace did, he was under threat for his job, and he had to deal with a manager, an owner in Steve Parish who's very, very pragmatic. He would have been out the door in a heartbeat. Look what he did to Patrick Vieira. The fans loved him. Patrick Vieira, Premier League fans thought he was this young, relatively young Premier League legend, progressive manager, and they sacked him for Roy Hodgson and brought him out of the retirement community that he was living in. And
it worked.
And it kind of worked, I guess, yeah. But they've gone back to that kind of young, progressive manager. Glasner's a cut above Vieira in terms of his pedigree, of course, but it's still Parish would have sacked him in a heartbeat if he didn't believe in him. And Glasner had to prove that in his second season, and he did.
Yeah, I think he's done really, really
the
well.
turnaround's been exceptional from Palace, I think. And actually, you still hold that bad start against them a little bit. But as you say, the context of certain players leaving, Palace looking like they were in a little bit of a kind of creative void, I don't think helped. But we've seen players step up. Chris Richards stepping up into that team. I think people were very excited about him as a youngster. And now seeing him move into that role that Chalobah was occupying, I've been impressed. Daniel Munoz has been brilliant pretty much since the day he walked through the door. I think Glasner's doing a very good job at Palace.
No Wharton as well. Eze, I think he scored 2 goals from 65 shots as well. He's
Wharton
not in the
came back
shooting
last
books.
night. It was nice to see.
That is nice to see. Right, Man United. This could be a little bit spicy. Ruben Amorim. I had him down as an E, Jack.
Wow.
I don't think it's particularly impressive, if I'm totally honest. 1.2 points per game under Amorim. That's exactly the same as under Ten Hag. And look, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt because there is 10 years of issues on here. There is 10 years of poor signings. There is 10 years of mismanagement and lack of guidance. But did I expect them to still be this bad? 3 months later? No.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird one in terms of when you're talking about crises and stuff. And actually, United's record in the last 8 games or so isn't actually that dreadful, despite the fact that they haven't played particularly well. I think that I had Amorim down as a C because he has walked into another club on fire. Now, he did this at Sporting, where he walked into a club on fire, and within 2 years, he had them as league champions. I'm not quite sure it's going to be the same at Manchester United, but I do think he has experience in being able to turn things around. What I do kind of have some sympathy with him is that he's walked in here and thought, okay, let's see what I've got for the rest of this season. We're not going to challenge these Champions League places. We're not going to be amongst it. We'll give it a real go in the Europa League. That might give us a backdoor back into the Champions League. We'll work ourselves out in the league, but I want to experiment and see which players are going to fit into which holes, who I can keep in the summer and who I need to get rid of and start the rebuild. And I think that's been quite obvious.
You've definitely tried enough, yeah.
He walked through the door. That said, I do think that there are some pretty heavy tactical aberrations that we've seen in recent weeks that don't really make any sense.
Playing Dorgo on the right. Playing Mainu as a false 9.
Exactly. Both of those things really bizarre. And look, I understand playing Kobbie Mainoo as a 10, and he thought he was very good in that game that he played in the kind of 10s behind the striker. The next move to push him another one forward makes no sense when your system relies on a player who's going to stretch defences and open up space for those 2 number 10s in behind. I think that the experimentation is fine in terms of working out who goes where and what can be done. But I think maybe there's a level of, you just expect a solid team to be picked. Not that there's no rotations. I think that's important for United, that they're going to do that. But that generally there is a kind of move towards a feeling of, okay, we are moving in the right direction. And I think that's probably been missing a little bit too much for me to give him anything but above a C. But the circumstances probably put me right there.
Buvey, where are you at?
Well, it's the lowest grade I can get. What are you? What's the worst? A Z?
Yeah, I was thinking F, but you
100 out of 100. I mean, 0 out of 100. I mean, it's embarrassing. And this is Manchester United. He's come in and he's experimented. You can experiment at Brentford. You can experiment at Brighton. As long as you stay in the league, you can try different things. That they're hamstrung by different transfer policies. This is Manchester United. They spent a lot of money, a lot of talent. I know he's come in midway through the season. The win against Man City was great. Everyone's picking up wins against Man City. Apart from that, the big thing I question, I don't think you win a league in the Premier League with 3 at the back. I just don't see how that happens. Conte, yeah, and then we're talking it's closer to a decade that happened ago. 2017 that happened. Since then, you have to dominate the midfield. You can't lose that extra man in midfield by putting an extra centre back. The defensive unit, they're not any better with a back 5. They're not even any better with a back 5. So they're not defensively pragmatic, despite having a lot of experience still playing. Onana's still playing. Maguire's fit. I know Martinez has had injury issues. Delo's still tragically poor, I think, as well. So I actually question if his philosophy even works for any kind of major achievement at Manchester United. There's no way he'll win a Premier League with a back 3. There's absolutely no way. So he's doing all this experimentation. I don't think it's going to come to anything. Seriously, I think it's been an atrocious start. Seriously.
It has been difficult. I mean, if they lose another 8-9 of the next 14 as well, obviously he shouldn't be under pressure for his job, but the morale at that club will just be at rock bottom.
He might have to be under pressure for his job. He's not been good enough, has he?
Though, that, when you're looking at United, and he said this early on in his tenure, right, that going back and just trying to sort things out in the short term is not helping United in the long term. And I think there is a level with Amorim that he understands the scale of the task in front of him in a way that maybe managers who have come in previously will just be like, oh, it's United, it will probably be fine. I think he's there like, no, this is really bad.
I thought that at the time. I thought he had the energy. I thought he's got this extroverted energy to carry the club on his shoulders. Obviously, it's a bit of a cheap analogy. Jose Mourinho at Chelsea, obviously the Portuguese connection, very different managers for obvious reasons. Yeah. But actually, you're thinking, he looks like he's aged in the last 3 months. He's like aged physically. I don't know if he's even the first thing when Ed Sheeran bombed his interview at Ipswich, right? I know it's a small little details, nothing related to football, but he didn't like that. He didn't like the kind of the entertainment factor of the Premier League. He doesn't like the scrutiny with journalists. There's been a few little rough edges in certain interviews. I don't know if he's even cut out to manage Manchester United in the Premier League. I know it's crazy, but I think he's a little bit out of his depth.
I think he'll get there. Having seen, I spent a lot of time in Portugal and and dealing with the Portuguese league, and having seen him deal with the media there, that was the superpower. It was the personality. And yes, obviously there's probably going to be teething issues in terms of translation and actually moving into a secondary language. All of that matters, but I think that he has got the backbone to carry this club. And I think if he can't, I really, really struggle to see who can.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Okay, let's settle on a D. I think that's fair enough for Amorim so far. Spurs, Ange Postecoglou, look, same with Pep Guardiola and Rodri. You do have to caveat with the injuries. You know, Van der Ven starting 9 league games. Vicario's only started 12. Doggie's had injury issues. Romero's had injury issues. But there are some decisions and stylistic compromises you can make, and I just don't think he's necessarily done it enough. I do understand that you want to stick to your principles, but there gets to a point where you're just losing far too many games, and you do need to maybe adapt. You know, the best managers do have more than one method to play. They're not always full throttle. They're not always just completely carving themselves open. And you saw when they beat Brentford, that was a real turnaround in terms of how dogged they were, how determined they were to defend, and it just feels like they are so brittle as a side. I don't think, whilst they've got injuries this year, and that has partly been poor squad building, I don't think there should have been the level of drop-off that there has been. 13 league defeats, that's already one more than they lost in the entirety of last year. And this is a longer-term thing as well. He got off to that fabulous start last year, but this is a long-term thing, and I don't want him to be fired. I do think, what is the point after going through Mourinho and Conte and then instilling someone like Ange Postecoglou to only give him 2 seasons? But there are some interesting decisions being made. For example, James Maddison's your top goal scorer in the league, and he's a bit part player. It does feel like you could use players more effectively. I had him down again as a D.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where there are obviously circumstances outside of his control, and I feel sorry for Ange in some of the things that are going on there. There are also elements to this where I'm like, that's probably a little bit of mismanagement, and he does have to take some criticism and some flack for that. I think that whilst the injuries have been dreadful, there is also an element of, if you are asking your team to be the highest, intensity in and out of possession, and you're rushing players back and you don't have the squad to deal with that, and there's no kind of adaptation from that. I do think tactically he's adapted. I just don't think the intensity has adapted. And that means that you're going to continually roll through and injuries continue to develop in these ways. The way that they set up against Villa at the weekend, the midfield felt like it was made out of Swiss cheese, basically. The amount of holes in it, I think, was criminal against that Villa side. And whilst I think that it would make no sense to sack Ange Postecoglou, especially if they're going to put in Ryan Mason as an interim to the end of the season, like, what's the point?
Is Ryan Mason winning the Europa League? No. That is the only thing left this season.
You might keep them up. They're going the way they're going. If they hadn't beaten Brentford, they were in a relegation battle. They lost to Brentford.
Spurs won't go down, but the level kind of is, how much of this is on Ange, and I think that there is an element on it. I again had him in that kind of C, D category, because I don't think that there is loads and loads that you can do. I don't think any manager in the world will walk into that injury situation and be able to suddenly start winning 5 out of 7 games, right? But I do think that maybe another manager playing a less intense style of football might have had less injuries in the first place, and I think you have to take some criticism for that. I do think that maybe the stuff about him not tactically adapting is overblown a tad. We've seen Spurs' fullbacks far more further back in terms of the way
I don't know, 50 seconds into the Villa game, Porro's charging up.
But I think generally, I kind of got across the course of the last 3 months, there have been changes. It just doesn't feel like
not
Spurs...
worked the changes, have they?
It feels like Spurs are kind of stuck between stations. They're not playing Ange ball anymore. They're just not really playing anything.
Okay. Let's stick with D. I think that's fair enough. We've got plenty to get through. Let's talk West Ham, Buvey. Graham Potter. It's really early days, but it does feel like there's already been a bit of a stylistic change, and it couldn't really be worse than Lopetegui as well.
No, I like him a lot. I think he is a West Ham manager in the 21st century. I think maybe 20 years ago, it's obviously someone like Harry Redknapp in terms of style, but he's the 21st century, the 2025 kind of West Ham manager. They'll keep a lot of the ball. They'll be open-minded. They'll be attacking. He'll have access to kind of a little bit more funds maybe than Brighton. Back when he was at Brighton, obviously Chelsea had a lot of money and he didn't really influence things in that regard. I think West Ham with Potter will be very, very offensive, very, very entertaining to watch. They'll be fine. I really like the appointment. I don't get why people slag off the appointment. It makes no sense to me. I think he's a perfect West Ham manager. That is his level. He's a top 8, top 7 manager. He's a fantastic manager.
People have short-term memories. His job at Brighton was amazing. And after coming in for so much criticism when he was initially appointed, being like, who is this guy? You know, within a few years, every top club was saying, you know, or every pundit was saying Graham Potter's the next one off the rank. He went into an impossible situation at Chelsea, still got into a deep Champions League run for their recent success as well. It was just a bit of a mess. I mean, it's such early days with Graham Potter. Let's give him a B-. Everton, Sean Dyche firstly struggles, but then David Moyes, what a turnaround, Jack.
Yeah, it's been very, very impressive, right? And actually you see what a new lease of life can give to a set of players. I think, you know, ultimately what we were seeing with Everton towards the end of the Sean Dyche reign was just his inability to create chances, this inability to get up the pitch, the frustration of the fan base growing to an absolute peak, because not only were they unable to keep, you know, goals out, it wasn't like they were conceding loads, but when you're not scoring any, it only takes one. It's a bit like if you keep clean sheets, you only need to score one. If you're not scoring, you only need to concede one to lose a game. And Everton just felt like they were free falling towards relegation. But David Moyes has come in and really given the place an uplift, right? And I think that there are small tweaks that have been made in terms of the attacking potential of this team that have just allowed a few players to flourish in these areas. I think the kind of transformation and the reclamation of Idrissa Gana Gueye has been remarkable in this midfield, and what he's being able to put together in terms of just allowing, you know, the likes of Iliman and Diaye to have that freedom to go at players that was maybe denied a little bit by the end of the Sean Dyche reign. It's been really, really impressive, and I think David Moyes deserves immense credit. I'd be giving him B+, A-.
I would. Yeah, I think
it's a bit early to go mad.
Yeah, I think an A's solid. I think he also just started using some of the very good players that they had in their squad. Like Jacob Rahm wasn't used by Sean Dyche. Jesper Lindstrom wasn't used by Sean Dyche. And Sean Dyche just felt like he wanted to be fired pretty much the entirety of the season. It was really weird. From being such a fighter at Burnley, he just felt quite apathetic about the whole thing. Let's give David Moyes an A. Quickly, Wolves, Vitor Pereira. He steadied the ship, Buvey, after a difficult final few months under Gary O'Neill, when Wolves were fighting with players and coaches and getting sent off, etc. He's done a solid job.
Yeah, any season where Wolves stay in the Premier League with the quality in their current squad, he had to just keep them up, and I think he will. I think he's a little bit lucky with the form of the sides that have got promoted. I think there are some of them, well, a couple of them we'll talk about, are absolutely atrocious, and some of the worst sides we've ever seen promoted from the Championship. So I think they're a little bit lucky. I think if the quality had been a little bit better, they would be in a genuine relegation battle, because he's turned things around, but not to that much of an extent. He's just basically he's done the bare minimum. It remains to be seen what happens in the summer, but I think you have to give them a B for just keeping them competitive.
Nice. Leicester, Ruud Van Nistelrooy, Jack. Were you expecting more?
Not hugely. I think that it was a bizarre appointment, a bizarre moment in Leicester's season. Like, Steve Cooper clearly didn't work. There was obviously a little bit of lingering resentment towards the whole Nottingham Forest aspect of the whole thing. The fact that they'd played such brilliant football in the Championship for the most part, you know, under Maresca, and then suddenly you bring in a more pragmatic manager, which is in some ways sensible from the top brass, but obviously didn't fly with the fans at all, who just hated the football that they were playing. They get rid of him and they bring in Ruud Van Nistelrooy, seemingly off the basis of beating them a couple of times as his spell of interim manager at Manchester United. Look, Van Nistelrooy did okay at PSV, and I think sometimes that's forgotten in that whole narrative. And perhaps, you know, with a better side, he's able to influence a little bit more. But I haven't seen loads from Leicester that suggests that they've improved in any sort of way from that kind of dreadful start under Steve Cooper. And I think that ultimately it looks like it's going in one direction.
Sadly, yeah, I'd give him a D. I think Buvey, Ipswich, Kieran McKenna started so brightly, but it's all slightly fallen apart.
Yeah, I don't know if it's down to someone like Juric, for example, had a terrible game a few weeks ago, cost them massively. Is that down to Kieran McKenna trusting him? Potentially. I thought Juric was the right deal at the time. He's come into the club. He started the season okay. I don't know if that's down to Kieran McKenna, but the defensive line from Ipswich always feel like naive. There's an element of naivety. Some of the big transfers haven't necessarily worked. Delap's been fantastic. I think he's done enough to say that he is a Premier League manager. It's a big club, Ipswich. They've had some decent results against some of the bigger sides, but there is still in the relegation battle, and he's not doing his job in keeping them up in the league.
if Ipswich stay up, it's going to be because of Kieran McKenna. So I think that probably gives you like a slightly different element on it. Like if Wolves stay up, is it because Mateus Cunha has just suddenly come into his own? Vitor Pereira's doing fine, but like, is that the key? I think it is McKenna. If Ipswich get back into this conversation, I think that, you know, you see what that fan base means, and even after that big loss to City recently, the entire, you know, stadium staying to basically cheer McKenna and those players. I think he's created that entire culture at the club, and whilst it was always going to be an uphill battle, Ipswich still remain in the mixer. That loss to Southampton was tough, though. That was a real blow.
I'm so gutted.
I know, me too. I felt a bit for McKenna because he had to bring Juric in because Christian Walker got injured, and now they've brought in Alex Palmer from West Brom, so potentially we don't see our own Juric again. But yeah, that feels like a big decision that's gone awry.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, what are we giving him grades-wise?
B.
Fine. Southampton quickly. Russell Martin. What can you say about Russell Martin? I mean, he's the only Premier League manager I think that will go down to not see the final goal scored against his team before being fired. He was already down the tunnel when he was losing 5-0 to Spurs. Juric had a really difficult job. Look, I think he's used some of the players that they did have at their disposal slightly better than Russell Martin. Like Sulemana should have been playing more regularly. And Onuachu seems like he's got more about him than the combination of Brereton Diaz or Armstrong, etc. But it hasn't been ideal. That squad is so lacking in quality. I mean, except for Kyle Walker-Peters and Dibbling, I don't think too many will be getting Premier League moves at the end of this season.
Impossible job. Like, as in, I'm sure you could have appointed a manager who was going to keep Southampton up from that position. They kind of got stuck between stations in that they waited too long to fire Russell Martin, but by the time they fired him, they may as well have kept him on because they know you can get him back up from the Championship. So it felt like maybe just the vibe at the club needed to change. I'm not sure that Ivan Juric was necessarily the person to go and do that. I think they have improved subtly. Like, they have got better since he came in. They've gone a little bit longer. Onuachu is playing a little bit more in that kind of target man role. They're a little bit nastier. They're a little bit kind of darker arts in some ways, and that's how they ended up, you know, beating Ipswich in that game. Is it going to be enough to see them stay up? Probably not. But
get over Derby's points, Sally.
They have got slightly better since Ivan Juric has come in. They look slightly less, you know, they're going to fall apart at any given moment. And that's probably a positive. So, I don't know, maybe give him a
C-.
Yeah, he deserves a C.
Let's go with
Russell
C-.
Martin, you.
Yeah, Russell
He's Paul
Martin,
Jewell 2.0. Honestly.
Only, I think, Julian Lopetegui would have scored lower than Russell Martin. I think that might have been the worst appointment, maybe of all time. Yeah,
it wasn't ideal. It wasn't ideal. But guys, that is a grade for every Premier League manager this season. Thank you so much for watching. Let us know what you guys thought about our opinions in the comments section. Get your own grades down there as well. Massive thanks to Buvey. If they haven't already seen you, where can they watch your stuff?
Yeah, check out the club. Man City returning to winning ways on the club, hopefully.
Nice, Jack.
Thank you for having me, Dougie. Check out the podcast at Ranks FC.
Perfect, guys. Thank you very much. We'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.